Hello, my name is Abigail Manis, and this is my presentation. It is called Soundless Sirens, Lolita as Myth. Now, this is a continuation of an essay that I wrote for Alpha Chi's peer-reviewed academic research journal for undergraduate research. So I will leave a link to the essay below as well as to the PowerPoint that I'm accessing, so those who would like to can follow along. As long as I don't go on a weird tangent, I promise I'll try not to. Now, for those of you who do not know the Lolita the book, it is the manifesto of a middle-aged convict who had a pedophilic relationship with a 12-year-old girl named Dolores, or as he calls her, Lolita. It remains on the banned book list and is a very controversial book. Can't imagine why, but nonetheless is also seen as a great work of American fiction, though Vladimir Nabokov, as the name suggests, is not originally from America. A lot of his books were written about America and American culture, specifically this idealistic car culture that's seen a lot in 1955 America, which is when this was written. Now, my argument is that Nabokov's Lolita is an American amoral fairy tale. I've developed 3 pieces of information to support this. The first is the doubled identity of the narrator as the protagonist, which grants him complete control over the narrative. The second is the fantastical sexualized other and the magical and mystical references, as well as a whimsical sense of time employed in the novel. And the third is a curious mirror imagery that is not only present in the story itself, but is also a big influence on the structure of the novel. My first point, as I've said, is that there are 2 versions of the same character. There is the storyteller and the protagonist. Our main character shows us his control over the narrative with how the names have been changed. His own is a hint. Humbert. He reflects himself. There's also Annabel Lee in A Princeton by the Sea. This playfulness in writing the story is Humbert telling us, this is my world. These are my characters. So, as I've said, the story is told as a manifesto where Humbert is in prison thinking back on Lolita and the time they spent together. Humbert the storyteller, which is in present day and is the one writing the story, is sly, playful, often addressing the ladies and gentlemen of the jury, which are us, and lamenting to an absent Lolita that he has only words to play with, hinting that, if she were there, he would be playing with her body instead. Humbert the protagonist, on the other hand, is meant to be the hero of our story. At one point on page 129, the storyteller Humbert actually asks us not to be impatient with the, quote, tender-hearted, morbidly sensitive, infinitely circumspect hero of his book. This quick aside is crucially important to the argument that I'm making because this is textual evidence that Humbert acknowledges what he writes is not merely a manifesto or an autobiography. My second point is that throughout the story, Humbert refers to himself as many fairy tale archetypes. We see him as a hero, as a villain, as a monster, and also as an enchanted hunter. Now, the enchanted hunter pops up a lot. It's the name of the hotel where he stays with Lolita when they technically become lovers, and it's also the name of the play Dolores stars in at school. The playwright is Claire Quilty, Humbert's nympholeptic rival for Lolita and the man he kills at the end, for which he goes to prison. Humbert describes a nymphette as a girl between the ages of 9 and 14 with a fey grace, an elusive, shifty, soul-shattering, insidious charm that separates the nymphette from such coevals as hers. And of course, Lolita is one such nymphette. Humbert insists that he isn't attracted to young human girls. Nymphets, he says, are not normal human girls. They're diaphanous agents of pleasure and mischief. This othering and dehumanizing provides a way for him to justify his own perverted sexual appetite. The power of nymphets is described as a demonic, supernatural force outside of his control, rather than what it really is, an unhealthy fetish for uninhibited prepubescent girls who are unable to hide from or are simply not fully cognizant of the adult male gaze. The classification of nymphets serves another purpose. It allows for us, the reader, to see the story in more of a supernatural, fictitious light. A scholar named Stephen Swan Jones argues, though, that despite all of the fairy tale references and devices, Lolita cannot be seen as a fairy tale because, one, there's no moral. Nabokov actually hated moralistic fiction. And two, there's no denouncement of death. There's no happily ever after like you would see with Snow White or Sleeping Beauty. Now, since this novel puts us at the mercy of Humbert, the embellished storyteller, whose delusions lead him to believe the events of his novel transpired in this fantastical, nonsensical way, I still argue that despite the lack of a denouncement of death, Humbert's insanity allows this fairy tale to be created. Furthermore, though Dolores dies in childbirth and Humbert says the book will be published after his death, in a way, the characters in the story are made immortal by the infinite retellings, a cycle of death and rebirth. Now, speaking of death and rebirth, when researching this, I began noticing a similarity between Lolita and Persephone, the goddess of spring. The more I researched, the greater the similarities grew until I realized that their stories were almost identical. There are a few key similarities, though, between our titular character and the Greek goddess of spring. The first is a representation of youth and innocence. Persephone represents spring, rebirth, new life, youth, happiness, all that good stuff. And so does Lolita. As classified as a nymphet, Lolita is meant to be this sort of joyous, jovial, youthful presence that Humbert is attracted to because he himself is aging and, it's hinted that he's also impotent. They're both taken from their home by an older male to partake in fruits of the underworld. For Persephone, this is literal, whereas for Lolita, it's a little bit more figurative, but it still works the same way. They're taken by an older man and then forever changed by that man. They both also undergo a name change. For Lolita, her original name is Dolores, and Humbert gives her this name of Lolita that's very sexually charged, and racially charged as well, actually. And Persephone undergoes a similar name change. Her original name was Kore, but upon her marriage to Hades, she became Persephone, which I don't know what the direct translation is, but it's something along the lines of death or woman of death. A common title for this Greek myth and the name of the famous Bernini statue is The Rape of Persephone. And I don't need to go into detail as to why that is similar to Lolita's story. Lolita's story and Persephone's are both told as a cycle, death and rebirth. The book itself, Lolita, exists as an unbroken cycle of death and rebirth. The events of the novel end just as the writing of the novel begins, and Humbert says he has the book published posthumously after he and Dolores have both perished. So the beginning of the novel is the end of both of their lives. It's an unbroken cycle. Now on to mirror imagery. This book is fraught with mirror imagery, especially at the end. Often Humbert recalls looking at Lolita as through glass or through a crystal or something. And according to Nabokov himself, the prototype for the pedophilic, predatory, and impotent Humbert was none other than Lewis Carroll, author of Through the Looking Glass and the other Alice in Wonderland books, as well as a man in close contact with his own nymphet, Alice Liddell. Now, a scholar named Elizabeth Priolo wrote an essay called Humbert Through the Looking Glass that shows just how many elements of Alice in Wonderland appear in Lolita. She points out that at the end of the novel, Humbert even begins to drive on the queer mirror side of the road after killing Claire Quilty. Also, and crucially, this novel is a reflection of itself, as I said with the cycles. The novel also acts as a mirror for Humbert's own solipsism and impotence, as well as an attempt to, like Alice in Wonderland, escape reality in favor of his own fantasy. Don Quixote was a favorite book of his growing up for a reason, and guess who that knight's enemy was? none other than the Knight of Mirrors. Humbert fears his own reflection, so he creates a funhouse mirror for himself in this story and crafts a fairy tale to block out reality. Just enough information, though, slips through the cracks in his story to allow us to see what's really going on: the rape of a young girl and the impotence and declining health of an aging pedophile. So, to conclude, this is a book of seduction and hypnotism. Back when this was first published, Leslie Fiedler described it as the seduction of a middle-aged man by a 12-year-old girl. It's striking that a story crafted by an abuser can have enough influence on the reader that we actually begin to sympathize with his plight. I was listening to a podcast the other day someone sent me where the women were discussing Lolita and commenting on how sad it was because they both truly believe he loved her. After all, that is exactly what Humbert the storyteller wants you to believe. That is the fairy tale he's trying to spin. And we believe him. Thank you, and I am so sorry that I don't have more time. But if you'd like, you can look at my essay or do more research for yourself.